right, everybody, welcome back. So today we're diving into something a lot of you have been asking about, which is how to be more fluent in English. And specifically, we're doing a deep dive into this awesome guide you sent over called How to Develop English Fluency. I think this is going to be a good one. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, there is. There's a lot in here. And a lot of really great stuff. I think for anyone listening who's, maybe feeling a little bit intimidated by the prospect of becoming fluent in another language.
Absolutely. And one thing I really appreciate about this guide is it acknowledges right away that there's kind of a mental game involved, right? It's not just about memorizing vocabulary and grammar rules.
Right. It is funny because it's almost like, I don't know if this, maybe it's just me, but I feel like sometimes people forget that like learning a language, it's a skill.
It is.
Like any other skill.
Totally.
And just like, if you were going to learn how to play the piano, you wouldn't expect to sit down and be Mozart overnight. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah, you got to practice.
Yeah.
You got to make those mistakes.
You got to hit the wrong notes a bunch of times before you get it right.
So the guide kind of dives right in and tackles this idea of like the fear factor.
Oh, yeah. Big time. That's like, I think, the number one roadblock.
The fear of making mistakes, the fear of sounding silly.
Yes.
And it even gives us this interesting tip, which is talking to yourself in English.
Yes. I love that one.
Have you ever done that?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when I was, really trying to get my English up to speed. I'd just narrate my day. Like, okay, time to brush my teeth.
It's so funny you say that because I do that when I'm cooking.
Yes.
I'm like chopping vegetables and in my head I'm like, all right, we're going to saute these onions.
See, it works.
But I think what the guide's getting at here is that by talking to yourself, you're kind of creating this low pressure environment.
Totally, yeah. Like no one's there to judge you.
Right.
You can just be as silly as you want. And what's cool about it is it actually it taps into the way we learned our first language, right?
It does.
As babies, we just babble, we make all these sounds.
No fear.
No fear.
Just pure experimentation.
And eventually, it clicks.
And the guide also talks about how short, frequent conversations are actually more effective than those really long study sessions.
Absolutely, because it's like, think about it. If you're just cramming vocabulary for hours on end,
you're going to burn out.
You're going to burn out.
Yeah.
And it's passive, right?
It is. It's like reading a textbook versus having a real conversation.
Exactly. And this is where I think this guy gets really interesting, is it talks about language exchange apps. Have you ever tried those?
I've dabbled. I've heard good things about Tandem and HelloTalk.
Oh, yeah, they're great. Because you're connecting with real people who are learning, in your case, English.
Right. They get it. They're in the same boat.
Exactly. So there's already that shared understanding that you're both going to make mistakes.
That's huge. Like that fear factor we were talking about kind of goes out the window.
Exactly. And you can kind of help each other along, It's like having a built-in language buddy.
And it's not just about the speaking practice, right? You're also getting exposed to different accents, different ways of expressing things.
Absolutely. It's like immersing yourself in the culture of the language you're learning, even if you're just, sitting on your couch.
I love that. So we've talked about the mental game, the importance of short, frequent practice. Now, let's talk about something that I think a lot of learners struggle with, and that's making mistakes.
Oh, the dreaded mistakes.
But this guide actually encourages it. It says, embrace the mistakes. Why is that?
Because they're inevitable. You are going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
It's part of the process. It's think about anytime you've learned anything new, you didn't get it perfect right away.
Right. You got to fall off the bike a few times.
Exactly.
And what I love is this guide actually says, if you get stuck, if you can't think of the perfect word.
Yeah. Don't freeze up.
Keep going.
Yes. Use simpler words. Explain your way around it.
Be resourceful.
Exactly.
It's more important to get your meaning across.
Yes, 100%. Fluency isn't about speaking perfectly. It's about communicating effectively.
So then it's more about being resourceful and finding a way to communicate, even if it's not with the most sophisticated vocabulary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who cares if you don't know the word for exquisite? If you can say really, really beautiful and get your point across,
Exactly.
Right.
So true. So it's not about perfection.
No.
It's about progress.
Yes. And being okay with stumbling along the way.
Yeah.
Because that's how we learn.
But tell me more about why those mistakes are so important, on a deeper level.
Okay, so imagine you're learning to play basketball, right?
Okay, I'm there.
You're not going to sink every basket right away, are you?
Definitely not. Airball City over here.
Exactly. But each time you miss, you learn something. You adjust your aim, your grip, your force. Language learning is the same way. Each mistake is an opportunity to adjust, to refine, to get a little bit closer to that perfect shot.
I love that analogy.
And it's like each mistake you make, it creates this little imprint in your brain.
Interesting.
It's like, okay, I need to remember that.
So it's actually helping you learn even if it feels frustrating in the moment.
Exactly. Embrace the messiness of it all. That's where the magic happens.
Okay, I'm all about embracing the mess. But we've talked a lot about speaking so far, but what about listening?
Oh, that's huge too.
Which is just as important for fluency, right?
Absolutely. It's like you can't really have one without the other. And what's cool is this guide has some really awesome strategies for improving listening skills.
Oh, like what? Give me some examples.
So first off, it talks about the importance of immersing yourself in the language as much as possible, like watching movies, TV shows, listening to podcasts, anything that gets you used to hearing English spoken naturally.
That makes sense. So like instead of just studying grammar rules in a textbook, you're hearing them in action.
Exactly. And the guide actually suggests, like, starting with material you're already familiar with. So like, if you love a particular movie, watch it in English.
With or without subtitles.
That's the cool part. You can start with subtitles, especially if you're a beginner. It helps you connect the spoken word with the written word. But then, as you get more comfortable, try turning those subtitles off.
Oh, that's a good challenge.
It's like a little test.
It is. You're forcing yourself to really pay attention and rely on your ears.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you might be surprised by how much you actually understand.
Okay, so we're watching movies, listening to podcasts, but the guide also mentions something called shadowing.
Oh, yes. Shadowing. It's so much fun.
So what is it?
Okay, so basically, shadowing is like you find a recording of a native English speaker and you try to imitate them.
Oh, interesting. So like their pronunciation, their intonation.
Everything. Like their shadow, you're trying to match them as closely as possible.
That sounds fun.
It is. And it's so good for your pronunciation, for your rhythm, for everything.
Like a workout for your tongue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's another way to kind of like internalize those natural speech patterns that we were talking about.
And this is something you can do at any level, right?
Absolutely. You can start with short, simple sentences and then work your way up to longer, more complex passages.
It's all about those small wins, like we were talking about.
Exactly.
And speaking of small wins, the guide talks a lot about like actually using new vocabulary, not just understanding it, but like actively trying to incorporate it into your speaking and writing.
Yes. Because what's the point of learning all those fancy new words if you never use them?
Exactly. It's like, it's one thing to be able to recognize a word when you see it written down,
Right.
but it's a whole other level to actually be able to use it yourself in a conversation or in your writing.
Exactly. And that's where the real fluency comes in, is when you can effortlessly weave those words into your everyday language.
So don't be afraid to whip out that new word you learned.
Own it.
Right.
Even if it feels a little weird at first.
It's like wearing a new outfit for the first time,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. You might feel a little self-conscious at first, but the more you wear it, the more comfortable you become.
So to recap, we've talked about the importance of mindset, of not being afraid to make mistakes. We've talked about the power of short, frequent practice over those long, intense study sessions.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the importance of active listening and vocabulary use. But before we move on, is there anything else we missed? Anything else that really stood out to you from this first part of the guide?
You know, one thing that I really appreciate is how this guide emphasizes that fluency is a journey, not a destination.
It's so true.
It's not like one day you wake up and you're suddenly fluent. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a lot of patience.
And I think that's something that's really important to remember, especially if you're feeling discouraged.
Absolutely. Like everyone learns at their own pace, and it's okay to take your time. The important thing is to enjoy the process.
So celebrate those small victories along the way.
Yes. Every little step forward is something to be proud of.
Now, before we dive into the next section of this guide, I think it's time for a quick recap of what we've learned so far.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so just to recap, what would you say are the most important things we've learned from the guide so far about becoming fluent in English?
Well, if I had to pick a few key takeaways, I'd say the guide really hammers home the importance of mindset.
Mindset, yeah.
Like it's about shifting from a fear of making mistakes to embracing them as as like essential stepping stones on your path to fluency.
Right. It's like instead of seeing those slip-ups as failures, we're reframing them as feedback, right? Like they're telling us, hey, you're learning, keep going. This is part of the process.
Exactly. And on a more like practical level, the guide also highlights the power of consistent bite-sized practice.
Bite-sized. I like that.
Yeah, instead of those like marathon study sessions that leave you feeling like totally burnt out.
Totally. Those are the worst.
The worst, yeah. So short, frequent conversations are where it's at, just like you were saying. It's like little language workouts for your brain.
Mini workouts. I love that. Okay, so we're talking short conversations. We're talking about language exchange. And then, of course, shadowing, which we talked about.
Yes.
You know, I have to say, I think for a lot of people, that technique might feel a bit intimidating at first, right?
It can be.
Because it's like, wait, I'm supposed to sound exactly like them.
Yeah, and I think the key here is like not to get too caught up in achieving perfect imitation. You know, it's more about the process itself.
Yeah.
The process.
Okay.
Because when you shadow, you're consciously paying attention to all those little nuances.
The nuances.
Yeah, like the pronunciation, the intonation, the rhythm, all the things that we often do unconsciously in our native languages. But when we're learning a new language, we have to like really think about it.
Make it conscious, yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
It's like you're borrowing their vocal toolbox for a bit. Yep. You're trying out all the different tools and seeing how they work.
I love that analogy.
And just like with any skill, like the more you practice, the more natural those elements will become in your own speech.
Exactly. Muscle memory, right. It's like learning a new dance move or something. It feels awkward at first, but then you get it.
Okay, so let's say our listener is feeling fired up. They're ready to start incorporating some of these strategies into their routine, but maybe they're feeling a little overwhelmed. Like, where do they even start? What's one small, manageable step they could take, like today, to make some progress? That's a great question. And, you know, the guide actually offers a really, really simple but powerful suggestion. It encourages learners to pick just one new word.
One word.
One word from today's episode, let's say, and make a conscious effort to use it in their conversations this week.
I love that. It's such a small, actionable step. But think about the impact it could have, right?
Huge.
If you make that a habit, like every week you're picking one new word, your vocabulary is going to expand so much.
Exponentially.
And it's not just about like memorizing a definition. It's about taking that word out for a spin in the real world, right?
Yeah, you see how it feels.
Seeing how it feels in different contexts, trying it on for size.
Yes. It's like adopting a word and giving it a loving home in your everyday vocabulary.
That's such a good way to put it. I love that. So yeah, one word a week. We can all do that. Okay, so we've talked about the steps, but I think it's also important to touch on the bigger picture here, right? Because, you know, this guide really emphasizes that fluency is a journey, not a destination.
100%. It's not like one day you wake up and boom, you're fluent.
Right. It's a process.
It's a process. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a lot of patience.
And I think that's something that's really, really important to remember, especially if you're feeling discouraged or if you're comparing yourself to other learners.
Oh my gosh, comparison is the worst.
The worst, right?
Yeah, because everybody learns at their own pace, and it's okay to take your time.
You know, it's so easy to get caught up in that, especially with social media. You see these polyglots online, and it's like, oh, they speak 10 languages perfectly, and I can barely handle one.
Right, and you never see, like, the behind the scenes, you know, like all the work that they put in to get there.
Exactly. Everyone's journey is different. So focus on your own progress and celebrate those small victories along the way.
Yes. Every little step forward is a win.
And, you know, speaking of comparison, it's so easy to look at other people, you know, on social media or wherever and think, oh my gosh, like they're fluent in 5 languages and I'm, you know, still struggling with my English.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like we only see the highlight reels.
Right. We don't see all those like awkward fumbles and mistakes that everybody makes when they're learning something new.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And especially with languages because it's so personal. It's like you're putting yourself out there, you know, and it's easy to feel self-conscious.
Absolutely. And I think this guide does a really good job of reminding us that like everyone's journey is unique.
For sure.
You know, some people might have more time to dedicate to language learning. Others might have more opportunities to practice. But the important thing is to focus on your own progress, not on what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, comparison really is the thief of joy, isn't it?
It really is.
So, yeah, instead of getting like bogged down in what everyone else is doing and, you know, this guide It encourages us to celebrate our own wins, no matter how small they might seem.
I love that, yeah. Like, did you have a favorite takeaway from this guide, something that really resonated with you?
For me, it's got to be the emphasis on reframing our relationship with mistakes. It's such a simple shift in perspective, but I think it can make all the difference. When we start viewing those stumbles, as you were saying, like as opportunities for growth rather than setbacks,
Yeah,
it just makes the whole learning process so much less intimidating and so much more enjoyable.
totally. It's like instead of beating ourselves up for not being perfect, which none of us are, right?
Right. Yeah.
We're giving ourselves permission to be beginners again.
Yes.
To experiment and to play with the language and to have fun with it.
And that's what it's all about, isn't it? I mean, learning a language, it should be a joyful experience. It's a way to connect with other cultures and to expand our understanding of the world. It shouldn't feel like a chore.
Exactly. And I think sometimes we forget that, We get
Yeah.
so caught up in the grammar rules and the vocabulary lists and all of that we forget to actually enjoy the process.
Exactly. And that's where I think finding resources like this guide that remind you of that joy can be so valuable.
Absolutely. And this guide definitely did that for me. So for our amazing listeners out there, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this one final thought, which is, what is one small action you can take today, right now, to kind of keep this momentum going?
I love it.
Maybe it's downloading that language exchange app we were talking about. Maybe it's finally watching that movie in English without the subtitles. Or maybe, it's just as simple as like looking at yourself in the mirror and saying hello.
Yes.
Whatever it is, just take that first step.
Every journey, no matter how grand, it begins with a single step.
Yeah,
So what will yours be?
I love that. That's such a great place to end. And that's it for this deep dive. We had so much fun chatting with you all about English fluency, and we hope you got a ton of useful tips and inspiration. If you love this episode, be sure to check out all the other awesome content we have on language learning, personal growth, and so much more. Until next time.